Is Barcelona the correct club for him to regain his consistency after Rashford scored double figures in only one of his past 4 seasons when he was in the midst of his contract negotiations? Would some suggest that it's a choice that he struggles to be consistent? Actually, do you know what? I was going through the figures last night of Marcus Rashford's career, and it's amazing, really. He has only got into double figures once in the last 4 seasons, and he got 30 goals in 56 games in 22.
I think what people should do, I mean, there's a lot of vitriol every time Marcus Rashford comes on this show. The name Marcus Rashford comes on this show, Man United fans phone in and tell us, me and Jim, they categorically want him gone. I think we should lament the loss of a significant talent. I don't think he was ever at the level that people built him up to be, but I think he was a very good player.
Talent there.
But we should lament the loss of the culture of Man United, which enabled a player to lose his way.
So is that what you're blaming it on? Because it's interesting, isn't it? Because if you look over the course of his career,
I blame it on the industry.
There's 22 out of 44 games, 22 goals in 44 games in 1920. 21, he got 57 games and 21 goals, had a dip in 21-22 after the European Championships and all the stuff that happened there. 56 games, 30 goals in 22-23 was absolutely superb.
But after the European Championships, do you remember after the European Championships, he came back from the European Championships, he hadn't been fit a lot of the season, went into the European Championship squad, came into that, after the European Championships, the club allowed him to go on holiday for 2 weeks and then have a shoulder injury, which to me is...
Well, not a shoulder injury, surgery.
Backside of that face. Hang on a second, get your priorities right. I think a lot of the... Listen, you have to lay the responsibility for the opportunities that have been not taken by the player at his own door. But if you don't create the culture for these young men to respect and value the opportunities they've got, they get distracted by outside influences.
But there's personal responsibility to continue to deliver even when the team is struggling, isn't there?
Of course there is. But we know that there are very few leaders in football. There are more often people that are followers. Unless you create a strong environment where strong leadership blossoms, and that means that the lemmings, of which I think Rashford has a propensity to be one, follow in the way that you want them to follow, you lose them. And you lose them to distractions. They get involved with outside influences. They've got more interest in what they're doing in their social life. They make judgment calls like going out to nightclubs in China Whites when they've got smashed by Man City. They make the decision for their birthday. They make the decision to go and not turn up for training and go out on the whiz in Northern Ireland and things of that nature. And these are things that are clearly being tolerated by culture. Alongside that, you've got the distractions and the wealth and the affluence that football, you've got the culture that people are not allowed to be told the truth, because if you tell them the truth, they can't cope with it. It's only good news that they can hear. That's why you don't build resilience and you don't build leadership into sport. Now, I think he'll be successful at Barcelona, because I think the clear thing for Marcus Rashford is to get away from Manchester United, for Man United's sake and for Marcus Rashford's sake, and we should lament that because he is a good player. I've always maintained...
And the Premier League is losing a good player.
Yeah, and they may gain him back. As a result of going to Barcelona, being in a club that's far bigger than he is right now, far more successful than he is currently being at Manchester United, with a dressing room of people that are far bigger than him, that are proven winners.
Yeah, but the only caveat I would put on all of that is that I look at some of his contemporaries, and I don't think that you would have said at the outset of his career that Harry Kane was going to be a leader. I don't think at the beginning of his career...
I don't think he's a leader.
Well,
I think he's a great player. I don't think he's a great leader.
I think what he does is he leads by example. Yeah. And his example is that even when Tottenham, who had comparably had more difficult situations going on than Manchester United, they've changed manager a lot more often, and they've struggled in league positions in a similar fashion. He still delivered. He still delivered.
But that's a form of leadership.
Season.
Spurs never won anything under him, and in competitions like the Champions League in 2019, they didn't even turn up in the final against Liverpool.
Yeah, but he always turned up.
Well, he didn't turn up in that game. And
he was injured.
And there's been instances in the other games where he hasn't scored against the bigger opposition that question him. But I don't think you can question Harry Kane as a footballer. I think you can question him as a leader. It depends what kind of leaders you want. I think Antonio Conte made very clear to Daniel Levy as part of his little departing salvo that he thought there was not a single leader in that dressing room.
But my comparison is the fact that even when Tottenham was struggling, he would still deliver. So he didn't use the excuse of the environmental problems for not delivering on a personal level.
Yeah, okay, but that's removing the realities of individualism out of the equation. Everyone's got different personalities.
Absolutely.
Harry Kane's journey was a very different journey. Harry Kane wasn't lauded and applauded at 17, 18 years of age and arriving on a stage where suddenly he was the saviour. Harry Kane was punted out to Leyton Orient and Norwich City.
Absolutely, and there's definitely something in the rise of Marcus Rashford which was unexpected. Listen, everyone thought he was a good player, but he was thrown in on an evening, on a Thursday night. I was there at Old Trafford the night I was commentating on the game, where he wasn't even on the team sheet, and then all of a sudden he's in the starting 11. He scores a goal on the Thursday night, he scores a goal on the Sunday afternoon, And all of a sudden, he's a superstar within 4 days, and that wasn't expected.
And there it is, and that's exactly right. In this country, we have a propensity to get people, build them up to a stage where they can't be built up any further, and then whittle them down, and also put them into positions where they're not actually at. I've always been critical of the observations that Marcus Rashford is a world-class footballer. I think he's a very good footballer, but I don't think he's a world-class footballer. And so when you're judged by those set of standards and you're constantly being pulled down as a result of it, it has a diminishing effect. But I also think he's responsible for it in terms of his decision. I've listened to some of the podcasts where he gets a little soft music in the background, playing the whining methodology of how hard his life is. And most people will find it difficult to relate to. I also agree that just because you do a different job and you think footballers should be walking around with a smile on their face because they've cracked it and won the lottery every day isn't the real world, because it's their job. But I think Rashford will find his, and one of the reasons why I think he'll find his feet is there's huge motivation for him to do so. He won't be in the World Cup squad next year unless he makes an impression upon Barcelona. Well, and he tends to be motivated when those things come around.
And we want him to be, because we want the best Marcus Rashford available for England when it comes to next summer.
If he's better than what's on offer.
Yeah.
We don't want the illusion of what Marcus Rashford can do. We want the reality of what he does, because a lot of people created a narrative because it's a way to beat Man United up, which is, it was a raging success at Aston Villa. What is wrong at Man United? No, he wasn't a raging success at Aston Villa. He had a few decent games. And certainly people, and I heard Andy Townsend talking about his away performance against PSG as being pretty poor, albeit the home performance was better. I think he's a good player. I think he's very fortunate to have landed at one of the elite football clubs in Europe, because I think currently, with his performance, with his attitude, with his disposition, with the way that he's left Man United and the way that he did interviews with Henry Winter last December talking about leaving, I think all lead you to the conclusion that this is a player that potentially brings more problems than he brings solutions. But in Barcelona's defence, they've got a dressing room full of people that are far bigger than Marcus Rashford right now, and they've got him for 2 and 6 beside his wages.
Talking of players that have had a fall from grace, Raheem Sterling didn't manage to get many minutes or make an impact at Arsenal on loan last season. He struggled at Chelsea in the previous campaigns. He's 2 weeks back into pre-season and working on the basis that I suppose Chelsea at some point are going to present him with an option to leave the football club. I mean, at this point, is there an argument for just letting him leave on a free? Because, I mean, I know Chelsea are sort of looking for 20 million quid for him, but with a little bit of interest from Germany and maybe in Juventus, the chance of sort of moving him on must be a priority for them. He's got 2 years left on the contract, which is worth over 300 grand a week.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure they're aware of that. And they'll move him along in due course, ideally in terms that suit them best. And of course, if there is no appetite, desire, or regard for Raheem Sterling for any kind of transfer fee, Raheem Sterling's got to come to the party. Depends what he wants to bring to bear. You know, we're being led to believe that Rashford's taken some sort of salary sacrifice of some shape or description to go to Barcelona. I'm not sure that's right, but let's say he has. It shows a propensity to do something. I'm not surprised. I never liked Raheem Sterling the way he left Liverpool. I thought that was not engineered the right way. I think he's a good player. I think he's another one of those players that's been built up to a level that I don't think he was at. I think he's had good games for England. I think there's a constant thread of managers that are prepared to marginalise him. Pep did it at Manchester City.
Yeah, but he also embraced him for a long time too.
To a degree, he
Top
did.
scorer there one season, over 30 goals.
I accept that there were times, as I said, there was certain times when he was very successful at Man City, but the bulk of the time at Man City, and at certain key times, he wasn't as visible as one would anticipate someone has achieved some of the things that he's achieved and some of the potential that people thought that Raheem Sterling had, alongside the ability that they dictated that we should all acknowledge. But this last 2 or 3 years has been a disaster for him. He moved to Chelsea, and it wasn't successful.
No.
He didn't set the stage, and he goes to Arsenal almost as if Arsenal went, well, we might as well have you. It's a last-minute thing. We'll have you.
I mean, it was a great deal for them. From what I understand, the mechanics of the deal were very favourable for Arsenal. But, I mean, from his own personal perspective, having watched him as much as I did when he was playing last season, he looked like a player devoid of confidence.
He did.
And that's a real shame, because there was a point where he was full of confidence and he would actually unsettle defences because of that confidence.
But there's a part of me that would say, and it might be people think mean-spirited and belongs in a different era, that if you're in a position where you are as good as you believe yourself to be, you've got to overcome these adversities. You've got to overcome this. You've got to build in some resilience and get yourself into a position where you demand the opportunity to be successful again. And I think sometimes these players and these people in life that we lionise, when it comes to bumps in the road, they aren't quite what you think they are. Because it isn't just a reflection of how well you do when everything's going your way.
We look after them enough? That's the question. I mean, I'm looking back at that 2018 team, at 2020.
I think they're looked after.
Team.
I think they're looked after too much.
And 21 team, and I'm thinking, you know what? There was so much potential in a load of those players that after those tournaments have just disappeared.
Well, I mean, listen, if you're talking about Dele Alli and people of that nature, they're making their own
Raheem
choices.
Sterling,
And there's so many distractions.
Rashford, Foden have not kicked on from where you expect them to be after that European Championship.
I think they're all individuals and they're all unique in their circumstances, and I don't think you can put them as a homogenous group and say that this group of players hasn't kicked on, and they all haven't for different reasons.
But they all came from the same team.
Sure, but to argue that they're not looked after, I think is a foolish argument.
I didn't argue it. I asked the question.
Or to advance it, that they might not be looked after, because the one thing that footballers are is overindulged and looked after, and then perhaps not told enough of what they need to build character.
That's not looking after someone. Looking after someone is telling them, actually, you need to do this and you need to do that and you need to improve this part of your character.
That's a different argument then.
That's looking after someone just as much as the other side of it.
Yes. Is the industry honest about building character into players by telling them the truth? I would suggest it's not, because we don't allow it to be the case. And when you see, like I saw last summer, I didn't think that the media were hysterical about England's performances. I didn't think they were vilifying it. Yet the England players came out, and specifically Jude Bellingham, with petted lips about the way they were being treated.
I was on the touchline after the first game, and we were doing a wrap-up of the show, of the game, and someone said to us, well, you have to reference the fact that they've called out negativity in relation to the performance, and we were like, what? Yeah. What are you talking about?
Oh, absolutely. So from that point of view, it's one thing being able to do the right things. What you're saying is by looking after people, it means doing the right things by them. And some of that,
the right things.
And some of that might be telling them the truth. Yeah. Right? But then you tell people the truth and they don't like it and they can't cope with it. And it would appear that this generation, perhaps, and I don't want to be too global in my observation, are not capable of it. It's a one-way transaction.
Maybe
all the upside.
Some people.
It's like the argument about player welfare. All the upside, none of the downside. If you told these footballers 15 years ago that they were going to live the lives that they're living right now, but they'd have to play 60 games a season, you probably wouldn't hear too many of them saying, "Well, I won't be doing that. If I can get this kind of life, this kind of generational wealth, this kind of adoration, this kind of career opportunity, this kind of diversification to play for bigger football clubs all around the world, these life experiences, but I've got to play 60 games, I'll do that." Now they've got it, well, hang on a second, I'm not doing that. And I think it's all intertwined into a general destabilisation of the way that people in society look at outcomes and resilience and overcoming adversity. And it's not good.
It is that time of the year when you've got to negotiate with different clubs for your players, and players are interested in leaving, and you're trying to put a squad together for a brand new campaign, but all of a sudden someone comes in and swoops for one of your stars. Or in Brentford's case, someone comes in, swoops for your manager, your first team coach, your analyst, your superstar forward number one, your superstar forward number two, and your captain as well. A difficult summer for Brentford, because losing Mbeumo as well as the manager and some of his staff as well looks to be just the opening gambit, really, because Johan Visser has left the pre-season tour as his departure looms. I mean, look, after Frank going, Norgard going, the captain, and Mbeumo going, mentioned about the situation with the first team coach. How difficult is it if you're an owner of that football club and you're trying to put together a brand new season which starts in less than, a month, when you've got all this swooping around you?
Not easy, is it? These are the tasks that you bring in top people to do top jobs with. I mean, this time last year, Crystal Palace were facing, apparently, existential threat as a result of everyone that being bought, that was their best players, whether it be Elise, Eze, whether it be Joachim Andersen, or whether it be Gehi. And they managed to ride the storm out and sold one of the players that they actually wanted to sell, sold two of the players, and one of them they got top money for, and was drawn to one of the elite clubs in Europe, which is Bayern Munich. And it's an interesting phenomenon when you're now seeing clubs like Crystal Palace selling players to Bayern Munich, and I quite like that, because I've always believed that there's an unfortunate position of being clubs like Crystal Palace where some of the legacy football clubs can take liberties with you. They haven't got to pay the top money for players. And I think that's one of the reasons why Wilfried Zaha didn't go to Arsenal at that time, because Palace had valuations of him and Arsenal thought they could nick him for 40 million quid, and it wasn't going to happen. Now, of course, it's challenging. I think that players move around all the time. People felt that when Ivan Toney left, it was going to be an absolute, Hail Mary to the future of Brentford, but it wasn't. They were a better side last year to some extent. Now, the thing for Brentford is, if they're going to lose these players, they must ensure that they lose them on their terms, as much as they have terms to lose them on. And now £25 million for a forward, and I think Wissa's quite a decent player.
I think more than that, wouldn't it?
I think that they have to make Newcastle work harder They've made Man United work hard for Mbeumo. I don't think he's worth 70 million quid, but he is because someone's paid it. And so in this instance, there must be thought processes that are flowing through. They must know these challenges. They're not coming out of the ether. Two biggest things in football are gossip and money. So they would have known there was going to be interest in these players, and they'll know all this. And one of the things that reassures me, and it might be mistakenly reassured, because everybody at the end of the day comes up short at some point, at some stage in their evolutions or their cycles. Look at Man United, after dominating the Premier League for 25 years, are now in the doldrums, or certainly 20 years. Is that Matthew Benham and the thinking and the sophistication behind Brentford's thinking has always been there to be seen, in the same way that it's the same at Brighton. They make very few mistakes. So Keith Andrews, for me, is the component part that I spend a little bit more time being troubled by, because Brentford can rebuild and they can reevaluate. And, losing their captain for 14 million to Arsenal, not ideal, but notwithstanding that was always going to be the case once Arsenal came knocking, unless Arsenal were really not going to pay anything for him.
We asked Director of Football Phil Giles to come on the programme today, actually, and he politely declined.
But they don't, do they? When do they come on? When do sporting directors really come on?
Not very often.
Certainly, and so we mustn't read too much into the fact that he doesn't want to come on.
No, but what I was going to say was,
has been on.
Are we actually overlooking the fact that because of the high-profile departures, we haven't maybe paid enough attention to the players that have come into the football club?
Possibly.
You've got Queven Kelleher, who arguably is one of the best goalkeepers in the Premier League, and he was playing second fiddle to one of the other great goalkeepers of the Premier League. He's now going to be number one at Brentford. Yeah. Michael Coyote, who was on loan from Fiorentina at the end of last season, has had his move. It turned into a permanent move.
No one gets excited about those.
Very, very good. But
no football fan gets excited by someone they've already seen.
Jordan Henderson,
merely cementing. I don't know. I mean, Jordan Henderson, for me, is a spent force at elite level. So what does he bring to Brentford? He brings some. I'm happy to be wrong. But Jordan's most recent times have been to go to a country that he suggested that he didn't support, and was quite vocal about the human rights causes that they were trampling all over. Yet went and played over there, then came back after 5 minutes because he didn't like it and went to Ajax, and then got himself involved in conversations at Ajax that people couldn't quite understand as to whether he was staying or leaving.
He did very well at Ajax.
Sure.
There was a lot going on behind the scenes there, but he did very well.
I don't think we can draw a parallel between the Eredivisie and the Premier League. I don't think that the Eredivisie as a league is in any way near shape or form resembling...
No, but Arne Slot would say that the transition was quite smooth for him.
But he walked into an elite football club with elite players that are Premier League established.
And he's working into a football club that has got a history of signing very good players based on a data model, which has always served them well.
And that's why we gain comfort from it. But comparing a manager's experience to a player's experience is like comparing apples to oranges. They're two different skill sets. So Arne Slot walking into a Ferrari and ultimately having to buy nothing, and people might want to say it was a Mini because it didn't win anything at the back end of Klopp's reign.
I'm fascinated to hear what car's coming out for Brentford.
No, look, I mean, I think Brentford are a very, very good football club. I think Matthew Benham is a very good thinker, and I think there'll be no stones unturned. But to suggest that we can't get sporting directors on as a reason for potentially the travails that they're facing, you bring me a sporting director that's been on.
I wasn't suggesting that. I was just saying we asked him to come on, and he said no.
And he did the formulaic no.
But my view on it is that are we overlooking the fact that they have brought in players because there's been so many high-profile departures? Johan Vissa could be the latest of those. He could go to Newcastle. If Thomas
Frank was in situ.
Possibly, yeah.
People would be less concerned if they are indeed concerned. There'd be less confected concern on behalf of Brentford from the people that don't support Brentford if Thomas Frank was still in situ.
Newcastle, though, are the ones that we expect to make a bid for him. And Newcastle also, the subject of a bit of a scenario with Alexander Isak. We understand that he wants £300,000 a week in order to sign a new contract there. He's got a contract until 2028. I mean, there is a part of me that thinks, well, yeah, I understand why he wants that money, and I think they should probably just give it to him.
There is a part of me that understands that he signed a long-term contract and they don't have to do anything of the sort. So they
don't have to.
Well, then you get into the territory of, do you have to argue the realities of a player having the hump that he can't get what he wants?
Do you not think he's worth it?
I think that he is worth to Newcastle whatever they're prepared to pay. And there is a certain limitation to that, because it isn't just what you do for Isak, It's what you then have to do to others as a result of the
He's the
Isak.
star of the show.
Of course he is, but there's some big names in that dressing room as well. Tonali's no slouch, neither is Guimaraes, and neither is Joe Linton, and another few of the other players
They're
out there.
all getting good wages, but they also understand just the value of this guy and his goals and the difference it makes to that team.
Is that how it works then in the socialism world of Sam Massaface?
It's not socialism, is it? It's the meritocracy, and he does the star striking,
and they will consider they will consider that they are all part of a unique outfit. They'll understand that he might be the cherry on the top, but believe me, in a dressing room, if someone else's wages go up, there's not a tacit acceptance. Well, he's the star, so we shouldn't get a pay rise.
Well, the alternative is to lose him eventually.
That's always an alternative, because you're as secure as the long-term position of your contract. Now, do you believe that Alexander Isak, if he continues to be as good as we think he is and as good as he's exhibited, right, that he's going to be at Newcastle unless Newcastle start
Alexander
to win
Isak, Usak's the boxer.
Isak, sorry, I've got boxing in my brain. Thank you. I don't think he will be. I think it's a balancing act between what he wants and what you've got him under contract to do, what you gave him when he signed a contract, and what opportunities you facilitated for him to come into the Premier League against what the market forces dictate. I am with you to some extent. If the best players in the world are getting, or the best players in the league, or the best players in other clubs that he could join are getting £300,000 a week, then he should be getting it too. But I'm also of the point that he signed a contract, unless it's a real quid pro quo, a proper quid pro quo from the football club, which is we get you to sign for 5 years, and by the way, we put a £175 million release clause in, and we're not accept a penny less. If there's a quid pro quo like that, then I can justify in my mind as to the reasons why Newcastle might get somewhere towards whatever he's on now, towards what he may want as a result of the economic. But really and truly, besides bad form and being a bad actor, he has no leverage. He has no leverage.
Because he's got a contract till 2028.
Correct.
Right.
And if we want to condone bad acting and bad form from players and suggest that ultimately contracts are not worth anything, then what does that say? You might say that it's realistic, but it's not to be applauded.
The reality of the situation is different, isn't it? If they were to receive a bid of 150 million quid, they would part company with him in a blink of an eye. So it's the same situation.
And 150 million pounds on the nail with no drip feeding down. And if people want it, then that's what they should have to pay. If you want to buy my player that I found, that I put in my team, that I gave you the vision before you even thought of it, and you pay me what I want, when I want, how I want, otherwise bugger off.
It was interesting to hear from Mikel Arteta this week. I mean, I watched a press conference. I don't think he said it in this press conference, but he said it, I think, to the written journalists, where he said it's getting more and more competitive each year. He's talking about the Premier League title race. The level is increasing. We know that, so our demands have to increase as well. Every year we see how things develop, and I see the right balance in terms of maturity, experience, youth and hunger, and all these ingredients are there. The thing is that there are another 6, 7, 8 clubs in the league that have the right ingredients to win, and there is only going to be one winner. So we have to focus a lot on the things that we can't control, and we can control the things that we can do to achieve what we want to do at the end of the season. Is he right in his assessment that there will be 8 teams that are competing to win the title, or is it more like 3 or 4 that can do that?
I think it's more like 3 or 4, don't you?
Yeah.
I think there's more teams vying to be in the top 4.
Totally.
Certainly, and I concur with that view. But if he's looking backwards for Arsenal to be a side that's trying to establish itself in the top 4 rather than win the Premier League, then that would be something I would be slightly concerned about if I was an Arsenal fan. I mean, I sit in a studio and share a studio regularly with someone that's not objective about Arsenal at all.
Who could that be?
Martin. But he accepts the point that somewhere along the line we have to move into Arsenal winning things. And whilst we all, and you said it this week, about the progress that's undeniable that Arsenal have made. They've gone from being an irrelevance that was knocking on the door of the outside of the top 6 to a club that's now re-established itself as serious competitors. But it depends. I mean, I can't imagine that the Arsenal hierarchy is unhappy with anything Arteta's doing, because we've seen progress most seasons. You know, we've seen a little bit of regression this season, but that was superseded by the progress in the Champions League. So whilst you were losing the progress and the building inside the Premier League, being a competitive force, amassing a certain amount of points because they were closer in previous years, I expected Arsenal to bridge the gap this season. And of course, with Man City dropping off, no one quite saw Liverpool's ascendancy. But with due respect to Liverpool, I know it's not going to be very popular. I don't think Liverpool were as brilliant as the outcomes dictated. I think some of the other teams dropped away.
Super consistent.
But not as spectacular and as dynamic a side as I've seen previously from Liverpool, but undeniable.
I think that's why they won it.
Probably right. But my main focus on this part of the conversation is to look at what Arsenal didn't do. and what they weren't able to achieve. And so with that in mind, it's curious to work out, because my point with that, Kieran, was that he, after browbeating him into generally accepting that somewhere along the line Arsenal got to win something. You can't keep on talking about potential. You can't keep on talking about progress, because the progress was a little bit sideways this year. He's been given a lot of money, and there's no denying that he's been given inordinate amounts of support. But I think this season if we don't see progress from Arsenal, and progress can only be if you get to a Champions League semi-final, then I suppose you've got to get to a Champions League final. And if you finish second in the league, then I suppose the only thing you can do is win the league. Otherwise, you're not progressing, you're treading water.
Yeah.
And if you start treading water, you start to move backwards. And I don't like the narratives being played out by Arteta about, on one hand, he says great things like, I can only control the things I'm controlling. But there's 8 other teams that could be competing for that league spot.
Yeah, I mean, what I will say is I think you're right. They did progress last year, because not only did they continued to finish consistently second in the Premier League, but they also progressed further and further in Europe. So that is a progression, I think. But I think stepping over the line now is, as you say, lifting trophies. And Gyökeres gives him a different dimension, because if he is as good as his goal record in Portugal suggests, then he will get more goals, they will get more goals, and that will push them closer to whoever is the eventual champion.
It is the panacea, because it's being billed as the panacea. The big thing that everyone says about Arsenal, and we talked about the fact they didn't score enough goals last year, but the previous year, January to December, they scored 80-odd goals with the formation that they had. And by changing the formation to have a point man like Gyökeres, you might change the construct of the team, and it might be disadvantageous. It might be the panacea, because everyone's saying, for the love of God, like with Chelsea recently, why don't you buy a centre-forward that can score goals? Because it's clear to everybody, you keep buying wide players, you keep buying midfield players, but why don't you buy a centre-forward? Because the common ail that you've got is you haven't got someone up top. Chelsea had Nicholas Jackson, and Arsenal bought Havertz. And no one could understand why everyone else seemed to have the 2020 vision, and Arteta doesn't. It must mean that Arteta sees it slightly differently. Now he's aligned himself with that particular outcome.
Or it means that they were just waiting for the striker that they wanted. So in January, when everyone was saying buy a striker, he was like, well, actually, I can't do it at this moment in time because my sporting director's left. The plans aren't in place, and we're not going to be able to get him out of Sporting Lisbon at this time, but we will be able to do it this summer.
Is a new phenomenon that's only just come out of the ether.
No, he was talked about last summer, so...
Yeah, not at the same level he's being talked about now. And some of that phenomenon has been elevated by the arrival of Ruben Amorim into Manchester United, and it's drawn attention because this is a player, I mean, his goal-scoring record over the last couple of years is phenomenal. This is a player that didn't cut it in other football clubs inside the English pyramid, that's gone over to Sporting, smashed it, and is now coming back.
Commentary.
To a degree, yeah, and obviously some people would say that Coventry were very fortunate to have gotten some of the fees that they've got, and maybe even cashed in their sell on early because they knew that it was going to be sold this summer, and funded some of Coventry's ambition last year. And whether he'll translate into it, but the argument was last January was about what Arsenal needed to do when they lost Havertz. They got injuries left, right and centre to Gabriel Jesus, who they thought probably was going to get them through the January window. Tried to put in offers for Ollie Watkins and didn't really get anywhere with it because Ollie Watkins' offer wasn't really a meaningful offer that Aston Villa were ever going to consider, were they?
No. Crystal Palace have submitted an appeal against their demotion from the Europa League and into the Conference League. The appeal is against UEFA, which issued the punishment. French club Lyon and Premier League rivals Nottingham Forest. The Eagles were punished for breaching multi-club ownership rules as American businessman John Textor owned a stake in the club and is the majority shareholder of Lyon, who also qualified for the Europa League. It was a bit of a technicality, really, because they didn't do some paperwork before March the 1st. A decision, though, is expected on or before the 11th of August. But the draw for the Conference League playoff, which someone's got to be in, takes place on the 4th of August. Look, I mean, Crystal Palace have got to throw the kitchen sink at this, but the timing of the decision is a concern, isn't it?
Well, it is what it is. It's UEFA that have got to find their way through the scheduling of the fixtures. Palace can still buy players, can still focus on being in Europe, because we know that the commercial returns, if you go into the Europa League, there's a distinct possibility that Palace might get to the round of 16. and it has a certain amount of revenue, there's a distinct possibility if Palace go into the Europa Conference League that they might get to semi-finals or final. And so with that in mind, the two revenue streams are comparable. If you go out,
do you think so?
Yeah, I know so.
Because I did a bit of the maths this morning.
So
on
did
it.
Stefan Borson the other day, and I'm basing it upon his calculations. But they get to
you're basing on the fact that you don't think Crystal Palace can go on and win the Europa League.
Well, no, I don't, because if you look at the quality of the competition that's in there, it's probably on a balance.
Just won it.
I accept that.
17th in the Premier League.
I accept that, but notwithstanding that, in my judgment, I think it's likely that Palace will find themselves in a situation where they might come out of the group stages and they might get into the round of 16, but it's likely on the balance of probability and legitimate budgeting, which is what Palace would do when they're looking at their finances going forward, that they would perhaps budget for being in the round of 16. Now, it's also reasonable to assume in the Conference League that an English team, as has been proven to be the case in most instances, goes deep into the competition. So the economics are not too dissimilar. So that means that Palace don't have to sit there and go, well, we don't know who we're going to buy for. You kind of do if you in the worst case scenario.
But do you become more attractive to potential? I mean, listen, I'm not being disrespectful to Tottenham Hotspur. They won it because they were the best team in that competition. But that competition, since you've taken away the drop downs from the Champions League, is easier to negotiate than it was previously.
Was your question going to be, do you become more attractive to players to come and join?
My question is going to be, do you think that you can attract a higher class of player if you're in the Europa League compared to if you're in the Conference League?
I don't think so. I think that would, you'd look at the reality of the club in and of itself as part of the pool. Chelsea were in the European Conference League, and the reason why Chelsea were able to attract better players is because A, they've got a legacy of a club that's able to compete at the very top of the division, and B, they spend money like drunken sailors. Palace will do neither, right? And so with all that in mind, I don't think that's a reason to be unduly concerned. What we should be unduly concerned about is the inherent unfairness of the circumstance, but Palace are the architects of their own downfall. I don't like the rule. I think it's a stupid rule. What Palace are doing is they can't keep arguing the idea that they're not an MCO. The UEFA have already told them that they are an MCO. Whether they like it or they don't, they've got to move their argument on. Whether they like the idea that they were communicated through an email address that they don't think is particularly prevalent, the same email address that ultimately communicated to them with the Premier League's position on the UEFA challenges, the same email address that their own finance director provided in their accounts, saying in Schedule G of their accounts, we have to acknowledge the changes in UEFA's governance. So they knew about it, they just didn't deal with it. And the reasons why they didn't deal with it are a little bit convoluted. It could be that Texas didn't allow them to. My argument with Parish, insofar as Parish is making a song and dance about this situation, is you are the executive controller of this football club. You are the person that runs the football club. It's your responsibility. If you've taken in an investor and put their money in your pockets as shareholders and put their money into the football club to bankroll the club through COVID, if you are across the detail of the football club, then it's your job to make sure that these sort of challenges are negated. Now, where Palace are going with this now is going, well, hang on a second. If you put a March the 1st deadline down there for Nottingham Forest, and Nottingham Forest had better facilities to get communication because Marinakos owns Olympiakos and he already knew what UEFA were going to be doing because there's a clearer line of communication, that doesn't wash with me. But let's say the arguments can be runnable. But the same token, what the Palace are saying is that Forest were given dispensation by UEFA to actually have more time for March the 1st because Marinakos didn't comply with the obligations and has done the dance of the seven veils in and out of ownership. It's ridiculous. A blind trust is ridiculous. Who is the, if Marinakos puts his shares into a blind trust and so no longer appears to run Nottingham Forest, who do you think runs Nottingham Forest? Who is the decisive influence in Nottingham Forest?
So the fact that the whole thing is pointless, doesn't it render the argument useless?
Agreed. But in terms of arguing about Palace's position on a moral point is one thing, or arguing it about the construct of the rules is another. I mean, Steve Parish was arguing about the principles of we're not an MCO. We can prove decisive influence doesn't lie with John Textor. Well, if you could prove it, why didn't you prove it to UEFA? And by the way, when you did a Sky interview, and I'm not trying to bash Parish here, when you did a Sky interview and you're asked about influence, I don't think the answer is, well, influence comes from everywhere. Influence could be my 8-year-old son. The fans who influence me. When you're asked, does John Textor has any influence? The answer is no.
Stefan Borson called it a surprising legal move because it could give Forest and Lyon the opportunity to make submissions that could potentially undermine Crystal Palace's case. Would they have been better off just looking to annul UEFA's club financial control body decision that the club was too closely linked to Lyon? Should they have attacked it in that?
I'm assuming that Palace would have taken all the best counsel that they possibly could. One of the things that they could and should have done some time ago was when they took Textor's investment to look at the reality of any kind of conflicts for the future. And of course, in this moment in time, not just rely on the idea that, because their big argument is we have proved beyond doubt that Textor had no decisive influence. Right? Okay, well, you clearly haven't. But in the instance of being in any kind of doubt, what Palace should have done 6 months ago when they were deciding that decisive influence was the argument they were going to run if they were ever challenged or they ever got to a point when they're in Europe, was to have counsel's opinion, legal counsel's opinion, to say, if we run this argument, are we going to be solid? I would assume they didn't do that. Now, going into where they are now, I would assume, given the level of acumen that's in that boardroom with Parish and Blitzer and Harris, right, that are not fools by any level, and ironically, I think Blitzer is more of an MCO guy than Textor is. If you look at Blitzer's ownership models, okay, It's very convoluted, but there's little doubt in my mind that he's got controlling influence in Brøndby. He might have it through a different vehicle. I think it's Global or HSBE. One of the shareholding is in Palace is in Global, a business called Global, and the other one is in Brøndby, is in HSBE. They might be the other way around.
There's definitely a connection there.
But it's definitely a connection. And the fact that they haven't had that one put across their bows for the European Conference League, I think is a miracle. I don't know where Stefan is suggesting that it's challenging for them to do this, but I would assume they must have good grounds for dragging Forest, because they think that the correspondence that's going between Forest and UEFA in terms of UEFA's attitude towards Forest being able to have different deadlines and move towards a different deadline might be more compelling, or might be a double whammy alongside trying to tackle what the UEFA adjudicatory panel as denoted.
Yeah, and look, quite rightly, the Crystal Palace fans are upset by this, and I think I completely understand and sympathise with that. Good morning. Would Everton suffer the same fate as Palace if they qualify for Europe? Obviously, the Freakins own Roma too. Great show, guys. I suppose there would certainly be an investigation into that if they were in a blind trust or not. That'd be something that maybe Everton have to worry about next year. My take is Palace should be out of Europe completely, says one text. This is Neil on the Wirral. They broke the rules. They should be out. They shouldn't go into the Conference League as they haven't qualified for it. Forest shouldn't go into the Europa also as they haven't qualified for it. Sick of this default process. We'll get into the protests in just a second. What was your assessment on that Everton situation?
Well, I'm assuming in the same way that other clubs have been able to find their way through it, such as Manchester United, that the clubs that are well organised and focused on the challenges and the opportunities that may come their way will go through the ridiculous charade of creating the optics that deliver the outcomes that UEFA seem to require. I mean, we make this argument, you and I, don't we, about MCOs and the idea that MCOs are allowed in some respects, but then disadvantaged by the very principles of having them in the first place.
Yeah, we don't understand it. We don't understand why it's allowed if you can't have the benefits of it.
I do and I don't understand it. I understand the principle of allowing it to be on different continents because it doesn't affect the competition, albeit the FIFA World Club Championship pulls it together.
Yeah.
I'm also clear in my mind that the one thing that I agreed and disagreed with when I spent some time with Arsene Wenger in Zurich was about the change in football predominantly being about ownership models. And the point I'm making here is I disagree that the only thing in football that's changed is owners, because he says, what's changed? The fans? No. The players? No. The managers? No. The main thing that's changed is ownership. I don't think that's true. I think everyone's changed. But I do think he has a point.
Broadcasting has changed as money's changed.
But players, the expectation of players, the way that managers' roles have evolved, the involvement of agents and how they've been able to represent 17 different people in the same transaction has all evolved. But my point I'm labouring at is the reasons why I think multi-club ownership is being tolerated by UEFA is the ownership models want it, and the resources and the sophistication of ownership models that will start to talk about restriction of trade and governance issues that are prohibitive, and that's the reasons why I think multi-club ownership. Look what Man City did with the rule book when the APT came onto it, the Associated Party Transactions. They went, hang on a second, you clowns, that doesn't stand up legally, and they drove a coach and horses for it. And I think some of the reasons why MCOs are being allowed in European football, and the RP Leipzig example, which is basically a branding exercise and really a drinks company wanting to sell more fizzy drinks, but notwithstanding it, they were able to get through the barriers of the multi-club ownership model, is because they're very sophisticated in their thinking, and the football fraternity sometimes isn't, and that's why I think MCOs have been tolerated.
They'll drive a bus through the legal loopholes eventually.
That's my point.
They will do.
Yeah.
Right, let's talk a little bit about these fans' protests that we saw in Switzerland yesterday. Members of the Palace Ultras group, the Holmesdale Fanatics, who organised the original march at Selhurst Park when there was a huge protest, yesterday travelled to UEFA's HQ in Nyon. They basically gained access to the building and hand-delivered a letter addressed to the UEFA president, Alexander Seferin, which demanded the reversal of the moral injustice and Palace's reinstatement into the Europa League. Travelling to Switzerland, taking in the protests, is taking it to a next level. To the ones that occurred, as we can see on our screens here outside Selhurst Park. Apparently they handed a suitcase of fake money over as well as this letter. asking him to overturn this moral injustice. Do you think there will be a part of UEFA that take this more seriously because of the protests? Do these protests actually achieve anything?
Well, protests and public opinion are swayed, and then governance and governments move. But there isn't a lot of momentum behind Crystal Palace I think the Premier League have been facilitatory and allowing Woody Johnson to be approved very quickly, so that the takeover of the shares that Textor had was facilitated clearly. The Premier League have rumbled about their discontent, but you tend to get more traction when you've got more noise and a disparate group of honest Palace fans that would have the right to feel the way that they do, that there is a moral injustice because you're taking the past and overlay it in the present. This is really a victimless crime insofar as a crime has been committed, because the two teams that are going to play in this competition, if Palace were still in it, have no index into one another. So when the ball is actually kicked now, Crystal Palace won't have shared shareholders in terms of Lyon and Crystal Palace. So it's all a bit ridiculous.
Yeah, there'll be no connection.
There'll be no connection whatsoever. And even if the argument was successful about decisive influence being able to be achieved, which Steve Parish is now asserting the principle, we have conclusively proven no decisive influence. Well, clearly you haven't. Now, we've seen a history of UEFA being reversed by CAS, and certainly in the Man City instance. But I'm not entirely sure that this is the same zip code, ballpark, or set of parameters that enable CAS to look at it any differently than UEFA have done. But the fact is that if Palace fans feel so inclined, again, I make the point, and people will look at my motivations, and I don't really care if they think my motivations are based upon a relationship with Steve Parish. If you are the executive control of this football club, you need to be across the details. And if you knew or should know that there was a challenge to the ownership model that you facilitated, you went out and raised the capital. You went out and took a shareholder in because you needed money. You put that money into your pockets and the other shareholders' pockets, and you use it to bankroll the club. And then roll forward 4 years later, and all of a sudden, that has compromised an outcome in the present. That's
everybody
on the
else
ownership
did it, and
Palace.
Textor didn't do it.
Yeah.
Isn't it Textor's fault?
How can it be Textor's fault? Textor was sold shares by the incumbent shareholders.
But he didn't put his shares in a blind trust.
But it wasn't incumbent upon him to do so. It's incumbent upon the executive control to introduce the thinking. And Paris made the argument that I can't make John Textor do anything I don't want him to do. Well, Textor wanted Palace to continue with loan signings in the Premier League from associated clubs, and Parish voted against it, which I think Textor was unhappy about. So clearly the governance is inside the football club in Parish's favour. Now, Textor sat in the studio and said, if I'd have been asked now, okay, people could say, well, he might be talking with a forked tongue. But when he said, if I was asked to put it into a trust mechanism to be able to avoid this challenge earlier in the time.
But if you're a director of a football club, you should know that.
Well, ultimately the entire board should know it, and selling shares.
He is a part of the executive of that football club by being a shareholder of that club.
And I think there's an element of a lot of people in football are light on the detail. Certainly businessmen that are playing in football, and their fiduciary responsibilities, and also the inherent obligations around every single rule. And we've all been guilty of it. Everyone. No one knows every single aspect, even a stato like you. But the fact of the matter is, if you're the executive control, if Parish runs the club and makes the decisions, and the board is weighted in such a way that the decisions go with his decision-making process, then surely it was incumbent upon him to have delivered an outcome that avoided this.